doors open, drag the bodies inside. You sullen fuck! What the fuck do you want from me? You could have told me the package was a man.
If it was a box of bananas, I'd use the post office. Get over it.
Are you ashamed?
And the fucking ring!
Holy shit, it's finally here. After almost a decade of this game being announced and waiting for it to release, Cyberpunk 2077 is finally released. And so far I put about, 6 to 7 hours into the game. I got to the title screen, and while it's not a 10 out of 10 must recommend hype fest machine that it's been led up to be, it's actually been a really good, really fun game so far. There have been some glitches here and there, actually quite a few glitches, but overall the game is pretty much as expected, with a really good storyline, some fun and entertaining side quests to go along, and a gorgeous and atmospheric world to explore. And today I'd want to see how well a variety of hardware can handle this world, and to see what type of a computer you really need to be able to play this game. Starting things off, I have would have been a pretty awesome mid-range PC about 7 or 8 years ago, and performs quite similarly to the base Xbox One and PS4 that came out around the same time. It features a Core i5 2500K, 8GB of DDR3 RAM, and an AMD Radeon HD 7870GHz edition. The 7870 here actually shares a decent amount with the consoles, as they both share the same GCN architecture, and as a result should perform quite similarly. And at 720p using the lowest setting, this PC managed an alright 29 FPS with constant dips into the teens or even single digits consistently, as seen by our 0.1% and 1% lows. Bundle that with the game looking pretty blurry thanks to the 720p resolution, and I really wouldn't call this an ideal way to play the game, unfortunately. Bumping things up to 1080p did help with that blurry Vaseline effect on the screen, but unfortunately tanked our FPS down to 20 FPS and made things pretty much unplayable. Quite unfortunate, as the majority of the parts in this system were actually considered high-end about the time when the game was announced back in 2012, but unfortunately this does fall below the minimum requirements for Cyberpunk, and unfortunately it shows, as the game really is not playable. So, how about we upgrade the GPU to meet the game's minimum requirements then? The game recommends that to run it at 1080p low settings, you need at least an i5 3570K, which we have an equivalent of, 8GB of RAM, and at least a GTX 780 or RX 570 or 470. And while I don't have either of those GPUs, I do have this GTX 970, which should perform on par with the 780. So how much of an improvement do we get by slapping this GTX 970 into the system? Well, with nothing but a GPU change and using the same 1080p low settings, we saw a decent bump to our average FPS, which hit around 47 FPS, and more importantly, we saw much more stable percentile figures compared to the last setup we have, with big improvements to our 1% and 0.1% lows. Given how much of an improvement this was, I decided to bump up the settings a bit, up to high settings versus low settings, using the same 1080p resolution, and to my surprise, the game still ran rather well, with an average FPS of 29 FPS and decent 1% figures. This is actually a very pleasant experience, as the game looks really good with some of the settings turned up, and the frame rate felt solid with these settings, making this my pretty much preferred method to play if I was using this hardware. But for the hardware that I'm actually using, I want to introduce you to my main rig that I use for gaming. Features a 6-core, 12-threaded Ryzen 5 1600AF, 16GB of DDR4 memory, and an NVIDIA GTX 1080, making this, while this system not top of the line, a pretty high-end computer nevertheless. So how well does it handle Cyberpunk with all the settings cranked up at 1080p? Well, rather well for the most part, as I hope with this kind of caliber of computer. At 1080p max settings, I was able to hit an average of 52 FPS with some really solid percentile figures, making this probably the smoothest experience yet. Couple that with the game looking awesome with all the settings cranked up, and you have your recipe for quite an immersive experience. But the main reason why to throw this system into the loop was even with all that GPU horsepower, we were still not able to hit that 60 FPS target, even at 1080p, which is what I wanted to point out with this game at the moment, as unfortunately it's probably not best optimized at launch. Doing a quick Reddit search on the Cyberpunk subreddit, there's tons of people complaining about how the game is practically unplayable on their Xbox One and PS4s, which makes sense as I felt the same way when playing this game on the HD 7870, which is rather unfortunate as this game felt like it was marketed towards those consoles, especially on how long it's been in development. Maybe it needed another year or two cooking in the oven for some optimizations, or maybe it's a sign that these consoles are almost 8 years old now and considered last generation at this point with the release of the new Xbox and PS5. But either way, if you're just in it for the story and not the amazing visuals, you can still get away with running on the lower end hardware, but I honestly would wait maybe 6 months or maybe even a year at this point for the game to get patched and just better well optimized. Because looking at the past projects that CD Projekt Red has done, especially with The Witcher 3, at launch the game was really rough, especially on lower end hardware, but after about a year or two, the game was actually really well optimized, and we eventually even saw a Switch port of the game, which I thought was practically impossible. So, given their track record, I think the game can be done, it's just going to take some time at this point. But unfortunately, that's all speculation at this point, and the actual product we received today, or at least on launch, was pretty buggy and unfortunately not well optimized for lower end hardware. And hey, that's just what it is. If you got any questions about the game or just computers in general, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. Subscribe if you want to see some more, and hey, thank you so much for watching, and hopefully you have a good one. Take care now. Bye.